The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle as tourists began gathering for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Marcus Henderson, a wealthy businessman from New York who had made his fortune in real estate. He wore an expensive tailored suit and carried himself with an air of superiority that seemed to announce his importance to anyone within earshot. Marcus had arrived in London 3 days earlier for what he called a quick European tour, though his real purpose was to boast about his travels on social media and impress his business associates back home. He had already posted dozens of photos from various landmarks, each accompanied by captions that somehow managed to mention his wealth or success. As the crowd thickened around the castle gates, Marcus found himself growing increasingly irritated by the wait. He was accustomed to VIP treatment everywhere he went, and the idea of standing among common tourists felt beneath him. He pulled out his phone and began complaining loudly to his assistant back in New York about the primitive nature of British tourism and how unimpressed he was with the whole experience. Standing perfectly still near the castle entrance was Guard Williams, a decorated soldier who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard. His red tunic was immaculate, his bearskin hat positioned precisely, and his expression remained stoically neutral despite the growing crowd around him. Williams had been performing ceremonial duties for 2 years and had seen every type of tourist behavior imaginable, from respectful admirers to obnoxious visitors who treated the guards like living statues in a theme park. The guard's military training had taught him discipline and restraint that went far beyond what most people could imagine. He had faced enemy fire in combat zones, lost close friends in service, and earned commendations for his bravery and leadership. Yet here he stood motionless and silent, representing centuries of British military tradition with quiet dignity. Marcus noticed the guard and immediately saw an opportunity for what he considered entertainment. He had heard stories about how the royal guards were supposed to remain completely still, no matter what happened around them, and his twisted sense of humor began formulating a plan to test this supposed discipline. In his mind, these guards were nothing more than tourist attractions, paid performers whose job was to stand around looking impressive for visitors like himself. Other tourists around them began taking respectful photos and speaking in hushed, reverent tones about the history and tradition represented by the ceremonial guard. Children pointed excitedly while their parents explained the significance of the uniform and the importance of the guard's role. The atmosphere was one of genuine appreciation and cultural respect. But Marcus felt differently. He saw the situation as a chance to prove his own superiority and create what he thought would be an amusing story to tell at dinner parties back home. He began moving closer to the guard, his phone already recording, completely unaware that his actions were about to trigger a series of events that would change his perspective forever. The other tourists began to notice Marcus's unusual behavior as he approached the guard, with obvious intentions of disruption. Some moved away uncomfortably, while others watched with growing concern. A few parents quietly guided their children to different viewing spots, sensing that something unpleasant was about to unfold. Williams, despite his requirement to remain motionless, was acutely aware of Marcus's approach. His military training had taught him to assess threats and read body language, and everything about this tourist's demeanor suggested trouble was coming. Yet protocol demanded that he maintain his position and composure unless directly threatened or unless the situation required intervention to protect others or preserve order. Marcus positioned himself directly in front of Guard Williams, holding his phone at arm's length to capture what he planned to be a humiliating video. The businessman's face wore a smug expression as he began speaking loudly enough for the surrounding crowd to hear every word. His voice carried the entitled tone of someone who had never been told no, and genuinely believed that money could buy him the right to treat anyone however he pleased. Well, what do we have here?" Marcus announced to his phone camera, making sure to frame both himself and the motionless guard. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm standing in front of one of Britain's famous toy soldiers. Let's see just how well trained this little puppet really is." The crowd around them began to shift uncomfortably. Several tourists stopped taking their own photos and started watching Marcus with expressions ranging from embarrassment to outright disgust. A British family standing nearby exchanged glances of horror, while an elderly veteran wearing his service medal shook his head in dismay. The children who had been excitedly learning about the guards now looked confused and upset by the ugly scene unfolding before them. Marcus continued his performance, completely oblivious to the growing hostility of the crowd around him. "I bet this guy makes minimum wage to stand here like a statue all day. What a pathetic career choice." He laughed loudly at his own joke, then moved even closer to the guard, invading his personal space in a way that would have provoked any normal person to respond. Guard Williams remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead, but those who looked closely could see the slight tension in his jaw. His military training was being put to the ultimate test as he fought every instinct to respond to the provocation. He had faced enemy combatants with more respect than this tourist was showing him, yet his duty required him to maintain absolute composure. The businessman then decided to escalate his harassment. He began making ridiculous faces at the guard, waving his hands in front of Williams' face and even snapping his fingers repeatedly near the soldier's ear. Each action was designed to be as disrespectful and annoying as possible, and Marcus clearly expected to eventually crack the guard's professional facade. "Come on, toy soldier," Marcus taunted, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "I know you can hear me in there. Don't you have anything to say? Or are you just a mindless robot following orders?" His laughter echoed off the castle walls, a harsh sound that seemed to pollute the dignified atmosphere of the historic location. Several tourists began taking out their own phones, but not to support Marcus's behavior. Instead, they were documenting his shameful conduct with obvious disapproval. Some started whispering among themselves about how someone should intervene, while others looked around hoping to spot security personnel who might put an end to the embarrassing spectacle. A middle-aged woman from the crowd finally spoke up, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Sir, that's quite enough. These guards are serving their country with honor, and your behavior is absolutely disgraceful." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement from other onlookers, but Marcus merely glanced at her dismissively and continued his performance. The tension in the air became palpable as more voices joined in expressing their disapproval of Marcus's actions. What had started as one man's attempt at cruel entertainment was rapidly becoming a confrontation between a privileged bully and a crowd of decent people who refused to stand by and watch such disrespectful behavior continue unchallenged. Guard Williams, despite maintaining his stoic exterior, was processing every detail of the situation. His years of military experience had taught him that sometimes the greatest display of strength was knowing exactly when and how to respond to a threat, whether on a battlefield or in a peaceful ceremonial setting. Emboldened by what he mistook for weakness in the guard's silence, Marcus decided to take his harassment to an even more offensive level. He began making mockingly exaggerated salutes while marching around in circles, mimicking what he thought were military movements in a deliberately clumsy and disrespectful manner. His voice grew even louder as he provided running commentary for his phone camera about the useless nature of ceremonial traditions. "Look at this guy, everyone," Marcus shouted, pointing directly at Guard Williams. "Standing here playing dress-up while real people are out there making actual money and contributing to society. I probably pay more in taxes in 1 month than this costume-wearing fool makes in a year." His words dripped with contempt and class superiority that made even the most patient observers cringe. The crowd's mood continued to darken as Marcus's behavior became increasingly intolerable. Parents began covering their children's ears and leading them away from the scene, while other adults started speaking more boldly about the American tourists' shameful conduct. Several people had now pulled out their phones to record Marcus rather than the traditional ceremony, creating evidence of his disgraceful behavior that would soon have consequences he never anticipated. What Marcus failed to notice in his self-absorbed performance was that his actions had attracted the attention of more than just civilian tourists. 2 plainclothes security officers had been quietly observing the situation from different positions in the crowd, communicating through discreet earpieces as they assessed the developing incident. Additionally, several off-duty British servicemen who were visiting the castle with their families began positioning themselves closer to the action, their protective instincts activated by the assault on their fellow soldiers' dignity. Guard Williams, meanwhile, demonstrated the kind of mental strength that had earned him commendations in active combat zones. Despite the obvious provocation and personal insults, he maintained perfect military bearing, his breathing steady and controlled. However, those who knew how to read the subtle signs of a highly trained soldier could see that he was not simply enduring the abuse passively. His mind was calculating, assessing, and preparing for the moment when action would be both justified and necessary. The businessman then made a critical error in judgment that would prove to be the catalyst for his downfall. Frustrated by his inability to provoke any visible reaction from the guard, Marcus decided to cross a line that transformed his behavior from merely obnoxious harassment into something far more serious. He reached out and deliberately knocked the guard's ceremonial hat askew, then stepped back with a triumphant grin as if he had just accomplished something remarkable. The effect of this action was immediate and electric. The crowd's disapproval transformed into audible gasps and angry protests. The elderly veteran with his service medal stepped forward with fire in his eyes, while several other spectators began shouting at Marcus to stop his disgraceful behavior immediately. The atmosphere shifted from uncomfortable tension to genuine outrage as witnesses realized they had just seen a sacred military symbol deliberately violated by an arrogant tourist, but the most significant change was in Guard Williams himself. The physical contact with his uniform and the deliberate disruption of his ceremonial appearance had crossed the threshold from harassment into assault on a serving member of Her Majesty's forces. Military protocol now permitted a response, and 20 years of training in both combat and ceremonial duties had prepared him for exactly this moment. The guard's eyes, which had been fixed straight ahead throughout the entire ordeal, slowly and deliberately moved to focus directly on Marcus. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of absolute authority and controlled power. For the first time since beginning his performance, Marcus felt a flutter of uncertainty as he found himself looking into the eyes of a man who had faced far more dangerous enemies than one spoiled businessman. The crowd seemed to sense that something fundamental had changed in the dynamic between the two men. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as people instinctively recognized they were about to witness something significant. Even Marcus's confident demeanor wavered slightly as he realized that his victim was no longer simply enduring his abuse, but was now actively engaged in the confrontation. Guard Williams moved with the precise, controlled movements of a professional soldier, executing a calculated response. In one fluid motion, he adjusted his ceremonial hat back to its proper position, took a single step forward, and drew himself to his full impressive height. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the unmistakable authority of a combat veteran who had commanded respect in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. "Sir," Williams said, his words measured and clear enough for the entire crowd to hear, "you have just committed assault on a serving member of Her Majesty's Guard. You will step back immediately and conduct yourself with appropriate respect, or you will be removed from these premises by security personnel." The effect of the guard's words was electrifying. Marcus, who had expected continued silence, suddenly found himself face to face with a man whose presence commanded immediate attention. The businessman's cocky demeanor began to crack as he realized he was no longer dealing with a helpless target, but with a trained soldier who was now authorized to take action. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, clearly relieved that someone with authority had finally addressed Marcus's shameful behavior. Shouts of "well said" and "about time" echoed across the courtyard as witnesses expressed their support for the guard's measured but firm response. Several people began filming more intensively, now capturing what they sensed would be the resolution of the confrontation. Marcus, however, made the catastrophic mistake of doubling down on his aggressive behavior, rather than backing away gracefully. His face flushed red with anger and embarrassment as he realized his performance had backfired spectacularly. Instead of humiliating the guard, he had succeeded only in exposing his own character flaws to a crowd of disapproving witnesses. "Are you threatening me, soldier boy?" Marcus snarled, stepping even closer to Williams in a clear attempt to intimidate. "Do you have any idea who I am? I own properties worth more than you'll make in your entire pathetic life. I'll have your job for this insubordination." The guard's response was swift and devastating in its professional precision. Without raising his voice or showing any sign of anger, Williams delivered a verbal counterattack that demonstrated exactly why he had risen to his current position through merit and dedication, rather than inherited privilege. "Sir, I am Guard Williams, recipient of the Military Cross for Valor in Afghanistan. where I served 3 tours defending the freedom that allows people like you to travel safely around the world," he stated with quiet dignity. "I have commanded men in combat, saved lives under enemy fire, and earned my position through service to my country. Your financial status is irrelevant to me. Your threats carry no weight, and your behavior brings shame to whatever nation you represent." The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Sustained applause broke out across the courtyard, with many people cheering openly for the guard's eloquent and dignified response. Several tourists began taking photos of Williams with obvious admiration, while others made sure their videos captured his inspiring words. Marcus found himself completely off balance, facing a man whose accomplishments and character made the businessman's wealth seem trivial by comparison. For the first time in years, he was in a situation where his money and connections meant absolutely nothing, where he was being judged solely on his actions and found severely wanting. The plainclothes security officers began moving closer, their radios crackling with quiet communications as they prepared to intervene if the situation escalated further. The off-duty servicemen in the crowd had also positioned themselves strategically, forming a loose circle around the confrontation, while making it clear through their body language that they supported their fellow soldier completely. Williams continued his measured response, his training evident in every word. "You may leave with your dignity intact, sir, or security will escort you from the premises. The choice is entirely yours, but this harassment ends now." The power dynamic had completely reversed. Marcus, who had begun the encounter feeling superior and in control, now found himself isolated, outnumbered, and facing a man whose moral authority was unquestioned by everyone present. His plan to humiliate a guard had instead revealed his own smallness of character to an audience that would never forget what they had witnessed. Faced with the guard's unwavering authority and the crowd's obvious disapproval, Marcus made one final desperate attempt to salvage his wounded ego. He pulled out his phone again and began threatening to post negative reviews about his treatment, claiming he would contact the American embassy and sue everyone involved. His voice grew increasingly shrill and desperate as he realized that none of his usual tactics for intimidating people were having any effect whatsoever. "This is outrageous," Marcus shouted, his composure completely shattered. "I'm an American citizen being harassed by your military. I'll make sure this becomes an international incident. Do you understand what kind of connections I have back home? I know senators, congressmen, people who could make real trouble for this whole operation." Guard Williams remained completely unmoved by the threats, his expression showing nothing but professional patience mixed with slight disappointment in human nature. Around them, the crowd began responding to Marcus's outburst with a mixture of laughter and disgust. Several British tourists started making comments about ugly Americans giving their country a bad reputation, while others simply shook their heads at the businessman's complete inability to accept responsibility for his own actions. The elderly veteran who had been watching the entire confrontation finally stepped forward, his service medals catching the sunlight as he approached Marcus with obvious displeasure. His voice carried the weight of decades of military experience as he addressed the businessman directly. "Young man, I served in Korea and Vietnam, and I've met plenty of Americans worth respecting," the veteran said firmly. "You are not one of them. This guard has shown you more courtesy than your behavior deserved, and you've responded by embarrassing yourself and your country. If you had any decency, you'd apologize and leave quietly." The veteran's words seemed to trigger something in the crowd's collective consciousness. Other tourists began speaking up, sharing their own thoughts about Marcus's behavior and expressing support for both the guard and the veteran. An Australian couple mentioned their respect for military service, while a German family talked about the importance of treating cultural traditions with appropriate reverence. Even some American tourists in the crowd began distancing themselves from Marcus, making it clear that his behavior did not represent their values. The plainclothes security officers finally decided it was time to intervene directly. They approached Marcus from both sides, showing their credentials as they politely but firmly informed him that his behavior had violated multiple regulations regarding conduct on royal property. Their presence immediately changed the dynamic once again, making it clear that this was no longer just a social confrontation, but a potential legal matter. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us," one of the officers said calmly. "Your actions today have been recorded by multiple witnesses, and we need to discuss appropriate consequences." for harassment of military personnel and disruption of public order. Marcus's face went pale as he suddenly realized that his attempt at cruel entertainment might have serious legal ramifications. The confidence and arrogance that had driven his behavior throughout the confrontation evaporated as he found himself facing the possibility of arrest in a foreign country. His threats about connections and lawsuits suddenly seemed hollow and meaningless when confronted with the reality of his situation. Guard Williams, maintaining his professional demeanor to the end, spoke one final time to the man who had tried so hard to humiliate him. "Sir, I hope you'll take some time to reflect on why this situation developed as it did. The respect we show others often determines the respect we receive in return." The crowd burst into another round of applause, this time sustained and enthusiastic, as people recognized the profound dignity with which the guard had handled an impossible situation. Many tourists approached Williams to shake his hand or thank him personally, treating him with the honor and respect that Marcus had refused to show. As the security officers began escorting Marcus away from the scene, his phone still clutched in his trembling hand, the businessman finally began to understand that his actions had consequences far beyond what he had anticipated. The video he had planned to use for bragging rights had instead become evidence of his own shameful behavior, recorded not just by himself, but by dozens of witnesses who had watched his character crumble under pressure. Within hours of the confrontation, videos of Marcus's humiliating encounter with Guard Williams began appearing across social media platforms. The footage, captured from multiple angles by numerous witnesses, quickly went viral as people around the world shared and commented on the stark contrast between the businessman's arrogant behavior and the guard's dignified response. The videos told a complete story that no amount of money or influence could alter. Viewers could see Marcus's deliberate harassment, his escalating aggression, and his complete lack of respect for military service. More importantly, they could witness Guard Williams's extraordinary professionalism, his measured response, and his ultimate demonstration of what true strength and character looked like under pressure. Major news outlets picked up the story within 24 hours, running features about respect for military personnel and the importance of cultural sensitivity while traveling abroad. Several military organizations used the incident as an example of how professional soldiers should conduct themselves when facing provocation, while tourism boards discussed the impact of badly behaved visitors on international relations. Marcus found himself becoming infamous for all the wrong reasons. His business associates back in New York began distancing themselves from him as the videos circulated through professional networks. Several potential deals fell through as partners decided they didn't want to be associated with someone whose character had been so publicly exposed. His social media accounts were flooded with criticism from people around the world who had watched his disgraceful performance. The businessman was ultimately charged with multiple offenses, including harassment, assault of military personnel, and disturbing the peace on royal property. While the legal consequences were serious enough, the damage to his reputation proved far more lasting and significant than any fines or court appearances. His name became synonymous with entitled tourist behavior and cultural insensitivity. Guard Williams, meanwhile, received recognition and praise from unexpected quarters. Military veterans from multiple countries reached out to express their support and admiration for his handling of the situation. The video of his response became a training example for ceremonial guards around the world, demonstrating how to maintain professionalism while standing up for military dignity when circumstances required it. The British press ran several follow-up stories about Williams's military service, highlighting his combat decorations and his transition to ceremonial duties. Public interest in his background led to increased awareness about the real people behind the ceremonial roles, helping civilians understand that these guards were not simply tourist attractions but serving soldiers with impressive records of actual military achievement. The incident also sparked broader conversations about respect, privilege, and the difference between wealth and worth. Social commentators used Marcus's behavior as an example of how financial success without character development could lead to profound personal failures when tested by challenging circumstances. Most significantly, the confrontation changed how many people viewed both military service and personal responsibility. Guard Williams' response demonstrated that true strength came from discipline, training, and moral conviction, rather than money or social status. His ability to maintain dignity while defending his honor became an inspiration to people facing their own challenges with bullies and entitled individuals. Years later, the video continued to resurface whenever discussions arose about respect for military personnel or appropriate tourist behavior. It served as a permanent reminder that actions have consequences, that character matters more than wealth, and that sometimes the most powerful response to aggression is measured professionalism, backed by unshakable principle. For Marcus, the incident became a defining moment that forced him to confront the reality of who he had become as a person. Whether he learned from the experience and changed his ways remained a question only he could answer. But the world would never forget the day when a royal guard's quiet dignity triumphed over arrogant wealth and left everyone speechless.